I think, again, the most important thing is showing up. Now, how does a parent help somebody get ready? Not the easy way. There is no easy way. It's not the quick way. It's relationship.
Executive functioning provides a sizable barrier for many neurodivergent people. From transitioning between activities to getting started on more complicated tasks, executive function skills are more difficult for them to master. That difficulty often leads to misunderstandings by misattributing them to things like personality flaws. Today we talk with executive function coach Seth Perler. He's the organizer of TFO, the Executive Function Online Summit, which takes place this week. Executive function is front and center on episode 133. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity? You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity Podcast.
We've had a good week of growth in our free Neurodiversity Podcast advocacy and support group on Facebook. Once you're a member, you can start discussions about subjects you're curious about, exchange ideas, and our Facebook group is where you submit questions for our Ask Me Anything episodes. We'll link to the group in this episode's show notes, or you can find it via our website, neurodiversitypodcast.com. One other quick note before we get started with Seth. During the interview, we'll be talking about TFO, the Executive Function Online Summit, and I wanted to let you know that you can sign up for the summit by clicking the link in our show notes. It's a special affiliate link, so if you join there, it'll help us out a little and you'll get a whole weekend of incredible content from the summit. The conversation with Seth Perler is next.
You're listening to the Neurodiversity Podcast.
I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. Seth Perler is an executive function coach, and he organizes the Executive Functioning Online Summit, aka TFOS, which launches later this week. So, Seth, thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be here. I'm excited to talk to you again. Do good work in the world.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, so I want to start off actually with a question that I've heard you ask a lot of the speakers who participate in your summit, and that is, how do you define executive functioning?
Yeah, so last year I asked every single speaker how they defined it. This year I did not do that.
I thought it was a good question.
I think I'm going to do it again next year because it's so interesting to hear how everybody defines it differently. So before I even define it, I think it's important for people listening to understand that. So it's not a new concept, but it's a fairly new concept for parents and teachers to come across. And that's like why I do my work and my summit is I want people to understand this because it's so important, especially for you and I, like working with neurodiverse kids. You have to understand executive function. So I'll start by saying that. I think two reasons why it's not very understood. One is because it's called executive function and it just sounds like, what the heck is that? So it just sounds clinical. And two is that a lot of the definitions and experts that talk about it speak in very clinical language. And it's very inaccessible for people who are not using that language day in and day out. The simplest way that my brain looks at executive function is how our brains help us to get things done. To get a little bit more detailed, it's how generally the prefrontal cortex or the frontal lobe or the front part of the brain, if you put your hand on your forehead, it's that front third part of the brain. That's generally where it takes place. And executive function continues to develop until we're 25 or 30 years old. So it's one of the last parts of the brain to finish developing, which means that there's a lot of hope for kids who have lagging executive functions. And finally, the definition of how we get stuff done would have to include the things that we have to do to get stuff done. So those would be the executive function skills. And different experts, some will say there are 3 main skill sets. Some will say there are 8, 10, 5. I talk about 13 or 14 or 20, depending on the day. So in order to get stuff done, the front part of our brain helps us to plan, prioritize, organize, inhibit, meaning hold back certain urges that are not aligned with what we're trying to execute. For example, if I'm trying to get somewhere fast and I'm driving my car and somebody's in front of me and I want to pass them and I ram into their car to get them to go faster, now I'm dealing with an accident on my hands. And that obviously is, I did not inhibit. I also didn't plan well because if I'm running late, to inhibit means to hold back. Impulsive is, to me, the opposite of inhibit, the other side of the coin. A lot of the executive functions have two sides of the coin, but impulsivity, meaning just, having the urge to say something or do something. So that's the impulsivity. So I don't know how many I just listed. Oh, then we have task initiation, which just is a fancy way of saying self-starting. Task persistence, which means follow through. Task completion, which is follow through and completing. Like there's all these different, and procrastination is not task initiation. Mm-hmm. So you could look at that as the other side of the coin. So executive function helps you to not procrastinate. Also, as we're defining it, we need to look at what sorts of things are we executing on. And generally, we're talking to parents here, parents and teachers, and generally what the concern is execution when it comes to schoolwork or responsibility. So my brain likes to simplify things as much as possible. So to me, those two buckets are the main ones. We're concerned with the execution on schoolwork and responsibilities because there are real world consequences with these things. And we're not concerned with execution in other areas like video games, social time, our kids' hobbies and interests and the things that they do for play and fun. But those things also require a great deal of executive function. And when it's a high interest thing, it's a lot easier for people to execute on and to build the systems that they need. We don't think of it that way, but if you imagine a kiddo who loves gaming, they have actually created a lot of systems in order to execute their gaming hobby more effectively. Mm-hmm. Planning and organizing and prioritizing and self-starting and et cetera.
I'm wondering if there is one particular skill that falls under the label of executive functioning that you think needs more attention, or a skill that impacts a lot of areas but might get overlooked more often than the others?
Not necessarily. The way I look at it is that I make up little silly theories. Well, I have a theory called spoke theory, like the spokes of a bicycle tire, bicycle wheel, and that there's a term called truing the spokes, T-R-U-E, truing the spokes. So they flip the bike upside down, they spin the wheel, and you'll see the wheel wobble when it's not trued, T-R-U-E, trued. And what they do is they'll look for where it's wobbling, and they'll tighten the different spokes to get it balanced, to get it true, to get the wheel balanced. All of the spokes impact the other spokes, impact the entire thing. So that's how I look at it. Like if we're going to, let's say, write an essay for a class, part of executive function is noticing details, or within that has to do with working memory and other things. But if the teacher says, here's the essay and blah, 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 make sure to read the directions, these are details. It's due on this day. We have to plan when we're going to do it. We have to know in our planner or calendar when it's due. We have to remove distractions, so inhibit distractions, get in a place where we can focus, get it in mode. There's so many things going on. So to me, I would not say that there's any one, which makes it really hard because parents or teachers want to know, well, where do we start? Probably the most important thing I would say is the many skills around overcoming the resistance. So the resistance is why we don't execute. I don't feel like it. This is stupid. Why do I need to do this? I'll do it later. I'll do it tomorrow. I'll do it in a week. I'm never going to do this. I'm bad at this. I can't do this. We have a million ways to resist execution. So developing the skill sets to have self-talk, to have emotional regulation, to have skills for, the skills of organizing and prioritizing and skills for getting yourself started, to have all those skills work together for us so that, I guess I would say, if it was a skill, the skill is building a relationship, if you will, a relationship with the resistance that helps us to move through that resistance so that we can start doing the thing that is really important in our life for attaining our goals.
Yeah, I think it's so easy to focus on, oh, well, we need to get organized or we need to figure out how to make a schedule or all of these things. But without doing that primary work of overcoming the resistance, you're not going to get very far with that.
Yeah.
One of the factors when you do your executive functioning coaching is that you ask families to consider, before they seek support, whether or not their child is ready to engage in the work, which is just what you're talking about, overcoming that resistance. What are some of the things that you look for to just help a family determine whether or not a child is ready to engage? Or is there anything that parents can do to help get their child to that stage if they aren't already?
That's a great question. So I guess let's start with how do we determine if they're ready? I mean, I'm actually making it harder this year with the people that I'm working with to tell me that, I'm having the kids actually do part of the application to say that they're ready, because working in person with somebody is one thing, but my business moved online after COVID started. And it still is, and I want to be in person again, and I'm ready to do that. But it's just different when you can sit down with kids in a space, get to know them in a space, and really pull their backpack up on the table, pull everything out, open up their laptop, and that's very different than the online thing. So the readiness online is very different. And for somebody to determine if their kid's ready, I mean, first of all, sometimes it's easy to know they're not, because they're just I don't want to do this. This is dumb. There's just a lot of resistance. And sometimes the kid's you know what? I do not want to go through what I went through last year. And they can really mean it that they want to. But when it comes down to it, they're not willing to show up. And that's the most important thing in my work, especially when it's online, but in person too. They just have to show up. If a kid shows up every week for a semester or whatever we're doing, or whatever the workshop is, and they're showing up and they're trying, and it doesn't even matter how much they're trying, they're giving some effort, we're golden. We're going to make progress. And what you do is you stack that progress, you stack those wins, you keep having more tiny, tiny wins. These are small wins. These are not big things. I think that's sometimes hard to see, because as the parent or the adult, you can be like, oh my gosh, this just needs to happen. Well, it's not it just needs to happen. It's actually a lot that needs to happen in the brain to build these skills. So, you want to ask open-ended questions. Are you ready? Why? Why is this important to you? What's the problem? So I would do, just some real dialogue around, why they're ready. But you still don't know. You just don't know. And I've seen this, probably the most blatant place I see this is with college students. It's just a different game. I get a college kid. Usually they're not a freshman. Usually they're a second-year freshman or a first-year sophomore. Second-year freshman because they failed their first year, or they're a sophomore but barely. They barely made it to sophomore year. And they know that after they got out of high school and they're not living with their parents anymore, they don't know how to schedule. They have a level of awareness to know that things are hard, and it could be easier, and that there are people that can help them. And they will say they are committed, blah, blah, blah. They really mean it. But a month later, they're not showing up. And it's not like the parent can be there and be like, hey, let's hop on the Zoom call or whatever. So that's a place where you really see it more blatantly. But it's really hard. So I think, again, the most important thing is showing up. Now, how does a parent help somebody get ready? Not the easy way. There is no easy way. It's not the quick way. It's relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Usually, most of us on this planet have grown up with different levels of dysfunction and maladaptive behaviors and codependency. And I'm not saying any of these things are bad. This is part of being human. It takes wisdom and time and age and learn how to sift through our own brains for what's true. In fact, one of our speakers, Dr. Joe, we talk a lot about discernment and things like this in that talk this year. But so we humans, how do we get our kid on board? Well, relationship, healing things that need to be healed, learning about attachment theory, learning about doing our own deep inner work as the adult on ourself that has nothing to do with our kid, figuring out what makes us tick, living the examined life, but building that relationship where there's more security, more safety emotionally for the kid. Because if I, Seth, or you, Emily, if we are working with a kid, first of all, we're not the parent, so we have an advantage there. Secondly, we don't live with them. We only see them for whatever period of time. So getting them to engage and buy in is easier for us. But you and I both still have to have a safe, trusting relationship. We have to make that kid know that we get it. We see them. We understand them. So when parents might do things like that, it's not like they're trying to be, push their kid away. It's just we've grown up ourselves learning a lot of these ways to do it. So learning the relationship and really rebuilding and healing anything that needs to be healed, and learning strategies for real great communication. Like, it takes a while, but that's where it starts. Because if I'm going to get a kid to let me pull everything out of their backpack and reorganize it with them, I'm never going to get them to let me do that if they don't trust me a lot. So we have to really build a relationship that they have to know, okay, I'm safe with this person. They're not going to make me feel bad about this. They're not going to tell me how disorganized I am. They're going to, if it gets overwhelming, I know that they're going to, just let me stop, and we'll put everything back in the backpack and do it next. They have to really know. Then there has to be what's called buy-in and ownership. So they have to own it. They have to be, it can't be like, you should want to do this, and you should, and everything would be so much easier if. It has to be the kid saying, you know what, this matters to me. I want school to be easier. I want more choices and opportunities in life.
Yeah.
So having open-ended type questions that ask them what they want and what they think, and really giving them time to really answer, and not interrupting them, and not diving into the conversation again and trying to direct everything, but really allowing a lot of spaciousness for them to really, really be heard.
And I feel like it's such a fine line and a balancing act for caregivers or people who are supporting neurodivergent kids. How do you balance setting clear expectations with also giving some flexibility? And let me elaborate on that a little bit. A client that I have came to mind when you were talking about that change from high school to college. He's a young college student, and when he was in high school, what was done basically was he had all semester to get all of his stuff done. He didn't have any really hard deadlines. But then the problem with that was at the end of the semester, everything had piled up and became super overwhelming and caused a lot of emotional dysregulation and a lot of frustration. So when he got to college, his professors, a couple of them are like, no, this has to be done by the deadline. If it's not done, then it's a 0. And he kind of panicked a little bit, but it was actually better for him because it was small amounts of panic spread throughout the semester as opposed to one huge meltdown at the end of the semester. And I think that that's one of the hard things to kind of figure out, because when you want to build that relationship and that trust, I think people assume that that means giving up on any sort of boundaries. What are your thoughts about that?
So that's actually a great question. And sometimes, when kids are put in these situations, they step up to the task and they see where they're. I'm someone who failed out of college, dropped out of a second college because I was going to fail out. And I at least figured out by my second college that I could drop out before failing out. I almost failed out of high school, quite literally. I went into college on probation because, I went through all this. I get that. And now I did not step up to the plate until I then left college for a few years, took a couple of gap years, if you will. I didn't call them gap years, but, started working jobs and just was done with college. And then I found my passion. Then went back to school and rocked it. But one of the problems that we have today is that there's not, a lot of choice for kids in terms of, when I went back to school, I knew what I wanted to do. They're just, school's compulsory. You wake up at this time. It starts at this time. The high school brain wants to sleep in. You have to take these prerequisites, blah, blah. And I think there's a lot to be said for getting really, 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 really clear on what your boundaries are. If it's a 2-parent family, getting both parents without the child to really sit down and see where the common ground is. That's been, I think, very important. parents really have to figure out what are our boundaries? Where do we disagree? Is it okay that we disagree? How can we still support each other? And then when there's a boundary, if you're going to state a boundary, it's so important to hold it, because our kids push boundaries, I think a lot because they would never say, I want them, but they want them because it feels safe. Even if they act like they cannot stand you right now and they can't stand what you're saying and they push back at everything, they need to do that several times to know that it's safe. For example, I used to rock climb a lot, and where I live now, there's not really any rock climbing, but in rock climbing, there's something called en belay, which means safety. So a person has you on a rope and they're your safety person, and you have to know you're safe. And you start small. When you first start climbing, you don't climb a really dangerous thing. You climb something very small, safe, with someone who's experienced. And if you fall, they catch you and you've just fallen 1 foot as opposed to 20 feet, and you're perfectly safe. And you do that several times before you start to really understand, this is how the rope works. This is how the harness works. This is how I can hold on to the rocks, it takes time. But the same thing here is that they need to know that those boundaries are going to be firm and consistent, and that what you say is actually going to happen. But they also need to know that it makes sense, why it makes sense. Even if they don't agree with you, they at least know what you're thinking, and they need to know that there is flexibility if there's a reason for things to change, that you're a reasonable human being, that if the tables were turned, that you would give them the same flexibility that you would want for situations in your life, to have reasonable flexibility. But that does not mean that they just cross your boundary. That means that if something's like consistently shown, you can be like, okay, cool, I trust that. I talk a lot about play in the gray. So again, you and I working with a kid, like we have this sort of very wide, imagine a spectrum. Completely black on one side, completely white on one side. So there's this spectrum, and then there's this gray all in the middle. And let's say there's 20 gradients of gray going from black to white, and there's these 20 gradients. And on one side of this spectrum is sort of this idea of like learned helplessness, doing too much for the kid, rescuing them, saving them, enabling them, not allowing them to fail in healthy ways, healthy, safe ways. When I say fail, I don't mean your kid getting in a lot of trouble and having to repeat grades and things like that. I'm saying like allowing them safe, but sometimes painful, uncomfortable ways for them to fail, to experience consequence, like doing too much to like try to rescue from that. And then there's sort of the other side. You've lost them. You're trying to help them. Now, on the one side, you're just helping so much that they're not growing. On the other side, you've pushed them away from you. You're trying to help, and they're like, I don't trust you anymore. Nope. So this gray area, you and I have this big gray area where we can like get in there, help them work with their, advocating to their teacher, doing the backpacks, whatever. But the parents, that space to work in is a lot smaller. But that's where the growth is not doing too much for them, allowing them to have their experience, giving them structure, but also noticing when it's getting too much and when to stop. Because if you don't, you're going to lose them and they're going to shut you down. There's no growth anymore. So there's this gray growth zone. Also, a great term to bring in here is scaffolding, where we're doing just enough, but not too much. It is not easy. So parents listening, I'm not at all saying it's easy. I've been doing this for a long time. So I'm very attuned with all different ages, blah, blah, all different types of kids, but if this is your 1 or 2 kids, and you don't have a giant bag of tricks, then it's really hard to figure out sort of where that space is. But that's the space you want to get into, is where you're scaffolding, you're giving them choice, you're allowing them to fail when it's helpful. Because when we do too much for them, it just can really create that learned helplessness and that lack of agency. We don't want to see them suffer, right? But it is absolutely part of life to have these experiences in order for them to gain what we want them to have, which is agency and some sense of independence and the ability to really craft their own future for themselves. Obviously, we can get into the whole discussion of independence and interdependence and dependence, but we're not going to go there today.
every parent I've ever met wants to do what's going to help their kid. And sometimes what we as parents see as success isn't always aligned with what our kids see for themselves. And then that discrepancy can be sometimes difficult to navigate.
Yeah, you have this, on the one hand, this infant that's 100% dependent on you for everything. But then they're growing and growing, becoming more independent. And your biological drive to protect is still there. But stepping back to see the big picture is really hard, because that emotional part that's like, I don't want to see my kid not succeed in this thing,
right,
by whatever my definition of success is right at this moment. That's a really powerful drive. So yeah, sort of biting your tongue and
watching to see where it goes. Yeah. So fill us in a little bit about TFO so people can find you if they want to dive into this topic and learn a lot more during your summit.
Yeah. So TFOS is the Executive Function Online Summit for Compassionate and Proactive Parents. And I choose those words very carefully because I like to work with parents who really try to be compassionate with their kid and proactive to do things ahead of time. So it's free, and get a ton of amazing people like you, Emily, people who really are just doing really good, what I consider to be heart-centered work in the world. So I really try to find experts who are coming from the heart and who share two things: knowledge and action. So it's for parents, but we get a lot of teachers and therapists that come, but it's especially built for parents to give them knowledge and action. What things do you need to know from all these different experts and their models and their frameworks and their backgrounds? What types of things do we need to know? And more importantly, what can we do? Strategies, actions, things that are very actionable that parents can do to support their kiddo. And it's good for parents of super young kids to parents of college kids, young adults. Mm-hmm. I feel like the luckiest guy in the world because I get to interview all these amazing people, and I get to also hear all these stories from all the families that are participating. So we have people from, over 62 countries. I don't even know how many this year because I haven't checked, and we get about 75,000 each year. It's grown. I was looking at the numbers from the first year. The first year, 4 years ago, we had about 11,000, and it's just grown each year since then. But there's really a need for people to immerse themselves for a weekend in this sort of stuff. It's just helps really, it's overwhelming on the one hand. There's so much coming at your brain. And on the other hand, as the mud settles, people have a lot of breakthroughs and epiphanies and aha moments.
It's awesome. And I know that the people who I've been able to tell about it have always enjoyed it and gotten a lot out of it. So for our listeners, you can find a link to the TFO Summit on our website or in the show notes. And just, Seth, thank you so much for coming on and sharing about executive functioning and about the summit.
Thanks. And please don't leave this out, editors. Emily's awesome. Emily does awesome work in this world. And Emily, this year, and you can leave this in the recording too, people should hear this. But as I've been talking to the experts this year, just so many people bring up your name. So thank you. All of your work is paying off. You're making such a good ripple in the world and just impacting people.
Oh, I appreciate it, Seth. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Executive functioning difficulties are one of the areas that neurodivergent people have to deal with throughout their lives. Yes, of course, we have neuroplasticity and can build some skills and strengthen neural pathways, especially when we're younger. But in general, executive functioning deficits are a major part of many neurodivergent diagnoses. But like with anything, the more we talk and learn about these things, and also teach our kids how to understand the nuances of their own strengths and struggles, the better prepared they are to move forward, self-advocate, and find success. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Thank you to Seth Perler for joining us. Remember to join TFOS, click the link in the description. Also, our first course in the Neurodiversity University is for educators of 2E students. Our second course will be out before long. Keep listening for more details as we put the final touches on it. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Our social media and production assistant is Krista Brown. The executive producer and studio editor is me, Dave Morris. For everyone here, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. This is a production of the Neurodiversity Alliance.